Okay, thank you for filling out this pre-survey experience. We now like to welcome Director Katherine Lucero. So please give a warm welcome to our very first speaker of this entire summit experience, Director Katherine Lucero. She's a director of the Office of Community and Youth Restoration, OYCR. Lucero is a former Santa Clara judge and was recently appointed as part of the state of California's redesign of its juvenile justice system, initiated by Senate Bill 823. OYCR is redesigning the former juvenile system, closing state youth prisons in favor of local rehabilitation services. OYCR's mission is to promote statewide trauma-responsive, culturally informed, and gender-respectful services for youth involved in the juvenile justice system that supports youth's successful transition into adulthood. And now Director Lucero has been kind enough to give us a presentation on redefining the juvenile justice system. So please, once again, welcome Director Katherine Lucero on her presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to Judge Irvin, to Professor Valerie, and to the team for inviting me today to speak to you about this important topic of redesigning youth justice, and specifically how the youth court community can fit into a continuum of a caring community response to help youth who make mistakes, heal those that they have harmed, and heal themselves in order not to miss a beat on their way to their adulthood. I think that my coworker, Elisa Hartz, is going to start the PowerPoint. Elisa? Yep, okay. Thank you. Okay, let me just, sorry about this. So Lisa, yeah, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And then, okay, so Elisa Hartz is here with me today, and she is counsel for OYCR. She was the first person hired for the Office of Youth and Community Restoration. I was the second person hired, and we've been at this now for about over 5 months. Next slide. We're going to show you a short video at this time about kind of that encapsulates our desire for OYCR. Go ahead.
Youth don't belong in jail cells.
When youth are growing up, they see what they see. Every kid came from somewhere. It starts in the neighborhood, and if your neighborhood doesn't have any type of things for you to learn from or build a skill or anything, your mind can't grow.
I remember the first time I went kayaking. It was just such a new experience to me, and it was just fascinating. And I'm a city girl, so it was just something really new to me.
Kids can be products of their environment, and I think it's really important to be able to look around and see beauty and see light and see nature and things like that.
It's important to invest into the neighborhood because it takes a village to raise a child, not just a family.
I think it's important to give them meaningful jobs, because if you start young with creating their minds and giving them all of this space to imagine and make a difference, it really prepares you for what real life is, because real life isn't like McDonald's.
I think that all youth should have mentors, because we all need that one adult that's
consistent. No, I think it's important not to forget about the family, and the same way we believe in re-entry for people who have been incarcerated, or in rehabilitation for people who have been incarcerated. It's the same thing for families. Don't just take them away. Find a way to support them and bring them together.
Giving these youth new experiences, new opportunities.
Where they taking pictures or dancing or playing an instrument, they actually get a chance to do something that they never done in their life before.
It allows them to live life and be happy. That can have a lasting impact on their entire thought process.
Thank you, Elisa. Next slide. I wanted to show that vision. It's so important that we recognize that there's a variety of root causes that cause our youth to get off track. Father Gregory Boyle with Homeboy Industries points out something that was actually coined by Mother Teresa. And he says our greatest problem or shortcoming as a society is that we have forgotten that we belong to each other and that we are responsible for each other, and that it does take a village to raise a child, to raise a human. And I think that the redesign of youth justice is for us to go back and to remember what our ultimate responsibility is to one another in society. And that is to remember that we belong to one another. Next. The US, as many of you know, but just to kind of reiterate, is way out of step with the rest of the world when it comes to the incarceration of youth. And in this slide, we see a comparison of the number of juveniles confined per 100,000 youth in 14 different countries. And by the term juvenile, I am referring to youth less than 18 years old. And the point of this slide is to show that in the US, that we incarcerate far greater proportion of juveniles than any other country. In green, we see the rates in other countries ranging from 0.1 in Japan to 69 in South Africa. Shown in orange, our juvenile incarceration rate is 336 youth per 100,000. Next. Moreover, racial and ethnic disparities are a huge reason why we need to help support youth and redesign the justice system. This slide shows that the lifetime imprisonment risk in a state or federal prison for US males, and that the lifetime risk of imprisonment is 1 out of 17 for white men, 1 out of 3 for Black men, and 1 out of 6 for Latinos. These trends of disproportionate minority confinement are similar for females and for youth, and these data are from the US Bureau of Justice. Black children comprise 14% of the US population, but 42% of boys and 35% of girls in the juvenile facilities are Black. Next. This slide stands for the proposition that youth incarceration is very expensive. And it's another reason why it should only be used as a last resort. Prevention is not only more cost effective, but it's human-centered, and it goes back to that focus on belonging to one another and helping to raise our youth to be welcomed, inclusive, productive citizens. It's really a sticker shock to look at that $5 billion estimate. The cost of recidivism, including later involvement in the adult criminal justice system, unemployment, the loss of future earnings, lost government tax revenue, additional healthcare expenditures, and the cost of all kinds of future issues that our incarcerated population faces. Next. There's an interplay of incarceration and social determinants, and it's really important for us to pay attention to that neighborhood structure, access to good education, economic stability, social and community stability. There's an interplay, and I think that if we can pay attention to this interplay, that we will have some success, perhaps, with starting to look at some problem solving. Next. So SB 823 was created as indicated by our co-leaders this morning, and that specifically birthed OYCR as a lead partner with counties to provide leadership to implement the closing of the youth prison system in California. Currently, there are 3 youth prisons that are operating. They will shut down for good and for all in 1 year on June 30th, 2023. And our office is to assist the counties in what's called realignment. And that realignment means that the kids are going back to their communities where possible, where there are what we are calling secure youth track facilities. Right now, we've counted 35 in the state of California. Some counties are too small, and we'll be sharing some regional facilities. Our job is to make sure that those counties are using evidence-based and promising practices to improve outcomes for youth and outcomes for public safety, reduce transfers to the adult criminal court, so really stem the tide and the need for judges and other stakeholders to believe that youth need to go to adult court system when they've committed that crime at 14, 15, 16, or 17. And actually, it's 16, 17 because youth that are 14 and 15 can no longer be transferred to adult court. But so youth that we're really trying to make sure that we have the information needed for our stakeholders to understand that it isn't necessary to send a youth to adult court for a maximum rehabilitative experience. And we can do that with research and data. We're also to help ensure the least restrictive detention alternatives are being implemented, reduce and then eliminate racial and ethnic disparities, and develop alternatives to incarceration. And this is not to suggest that young offenders should not be accountable for law violations. Indeed, accountability for decisions and conduct is essential for positive development and maturation. Rather, it's to observe that the science exists to guide policy and individual case practice for judges, probation officers, prosecutors, and defense counsel towards proportional and developmentally aligned accountability for middle and late adolescent law violators. Our currently worrisome rates of recidivism among younger offenders can be lowered, thereby contributing to community safety by adopting a developmentally informed approach to young offenders. Next. I wanted to just briefly kind of remind us where we've come from. In the 90s. There was this myth about the super predator. That myth was couched in terms of young teenagers, and disproportionately the argument was that they were Black boys, and this occurred in the 90s. The political science professor John DeLulio Jr. Really had put forth this theory, and actually recently I was reading in a book called Redesigning Juvenile Justice. In fact, I think that's the name of the book. I have it here. And he did actually in the book and to the authors apologize for that because it never occurred. And you can see in this New York Times article that was recently published that it was a myth. And courts are certainly beginning to understand that it was a myth and that youth are not the same as adults and need to have a different intervention. Next. And in fact, that's coming through in case law. We're worried about best practices because the science that we have learned and has developed over the last decade or a little more than that have shown, and the Supreme Court has recognized, that there is a diminished culpability and a heightened capacity for change for adolescents who are in the throes of adolescent development. So there's been a lot of discussion in the courts as well as in the area of science and human development. Next. So redesigning youth justice, I think, is acknowledging that youth are in that full adolescent brain development, that mistakes should not condemn a youth to a lifetime of stigma. Even really bad decisions or actions that have serious consequences, like those that the youth are in the youth prison system have committed, that youth can certainly be held accountable, but youth can also, and that accountability is critical, but youth can also move forward to contribute to society and to their communities. And thankfully, we are starting to learn and hear more and more about our youth who were formerly incarcerated and how they are beginning to contribute to our society in a very positive way and become role models. So how do we do this? Well, we have to develop that continuum of care and intervention that's developmentally appropriate, and impose and locate and find restorative justice practices that focus on positive youth development, limit high-level restrictive carceral settings consistent with the research and data, and allow for family and youth voice, plan for reentry into communities from the beginning, and cultivate the strengths of our youth using healing practices from both a faith-based and spiritual perspective, build relationships, encourage role models. And we have to remember that, in fact, it takes one person to change the course of a life. And developing that commitment and that access to that one person, if that is how that youth is best served, is so critical for us to begin to do as a primary intervention technique. Next. I'm going to go over a few of the mandates and mission of the Office of Youth and Community Restoration, just to have the context for who we are and what we're doing. Next. So one of the first things is, as I indicated, is we're getting youth close to home, because evidence has demonstrated that justice-involved youth are more successful when they remain close to and connected to their families and communities. Justice system-involved youth who remain in their communities have lower recidivism rates and are more prepared to transition back into their communities. Next. We're also to make sure that the youth are provided positive youth development, age-appropriate treatment. We are in the Health and Human Services Agency of the state of California. DJJ, the youth prison, was under the Correctional Department. We are under Health and Human Services. So our approach is a public health approach. It is a behavioral health approach. And we want to build that capacity and that continuum in the community to both reduce juvenile crime rates, recidivism, and to increase public safety, which is really the same goal. Because if we're addressing our children in a way that it's age appropriate and developmentally consistent with success, then that means our youth will be invested in their communities and be actually protective of their communities, because they are contributing members to society. So it really is it's a really one concept. Next. And then we're going to look at evidence-based and least restrictive in tandem. And we're already in process of working with another state agency that was already looking at developing a catalog of evidence-based practices from really all over the state, nation, and perhaps even the world. And we're committed to providing technical assistance to the counties to fulfill the mandate of eliminating racial and ethnic disparities. And we have lead staff expertise to roll out the technical assistance, and we're in the process of hiring the lead expertise, but we have our county liaison unit hired. We have just hired our data collection policy chief, and we're beginning to start really digging in to write the story of how this shift will be a benefit to our youth and our communities. We know that it will be a benefit, and we're ready to document that, working with the counties, of course. OYCR has already met with all 58 probation chiefs. We're meeting with the prosecutors from all over the state with one of our team members, Mark Buller. I'm continuing to meet with judges. And we are also going to be hiring some expertise on the dismantling the school to prison pipeline. And so we're really looking at all facets. Next. So the mission that is actually outlined in W&I Code Section 2200B is that we are to promote culturally respectful, trauma responsive, gender. Now the gender honoring is not in there, but it's in there for me. And we want to make sure that our youth have the ability to have delivered in the secure track facilities the types of services that ensure all that whole realm of trauma responsive and culturally respectful is there, as well as, of course, family engaging. Next. I wanted to show you a little bit about why it's so important for us to remember that not only are these youth that are have committed the law violations, but they are youth who experience a very high level of trauma prior to the law violation. And this is one study that showed that the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences of incarcerated youth, is high. This was a study done with Florida juvenile offenders, and that was 2014. And it shows that most youth, half of the incarcerated youth actually had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Next. And then this is a slide that talks about a little bit about perspectives of the youth who are incarcerated on pathways to juvenile detention. And it talks a little bit about that school to prison pipeline and how the neighborhoods possibly contribute, home can contribute, school contributes, and then back to juvenile hall, and then unfortunately sometimes back over to juvenile hall after release. The adolescent participants in this study, which was in 2015, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the date exactly, well, actually, yeah, 2015. And this was done by our UCLA partners, Professor Barnard. The youth said, described their home, schools, and neighborhoods as chaotic and sometimes unsafe. And they expressed a need for love and attention, discipline and control, and role models, and the helping for them to get perspective. Youth perceived that when home or school failed to meet their needs, they spent more time on the streets, leading to incarceration. And they contrasted the path through school with the path to jail, reporting that the path to jail felt sometimes easier. This is what the youth were saying. And all of them expressed the insight that they had made bad decisions, and that more difficult path was not only better, but also still potentially achievable. That more difficult path, meaning taking, staying out of trouble, maybe seeking out a different pathway. But we need to help with that. I think we have a clear indication, and we all know, I've raised children. I still help my kids. They're 25 and 28. We can't have a society where kids have to navigate this on their own. Next. And then here's a diagram again, 2014. It says girls versus boys on the adverse childhood experiences, that both genders have high adverse childhood experiences, high ACE severity, and girls have more than boys. In particular, girls have much higher exposure to sexual abuse. Another way to think about why and how kids should be supported in resiliency is in the justice system, is that we have to remember that youth are highly resilient, and but they need the programming and the access and the understanding from the professionals about how they may have gotten to the place where they are. And in fact, we need to ask more, instead of why did you do this or what did you do, but what happened to you, and try to unpack that youth experience. When we're talking about youth who are 14, 15, 16, 17, we're talking about, folks who've barely been on the planet, and they already have so many adverse childhood experiences, and unpacking those and helping them through that maturity process to understand and get perspective is so critical. And not having that punitive lens, but having that understanding and compassion lens. Next. And here's a slide that just details what happens to youth with adverse childhood experiences. There's higher likelihood of traumatic brain injury, other types of injuries, depression, PTSD, unintended pregnancy, higher rates of HIV and STDs, higher chronic illness like cancer and diabetes, more likely to engage in alcohol abuse, and less likely to have good educational outcomes. So there's so many reasons for us to pay attention to the youth that we're seeing in our justice system. The next slide is just a slide that I pulled in also from UCLA folks. Next slide, Elisa. Demonstrating a Canadian approach to working with our kids, life course health development. So when they actually saw that a child was in distress, they recognized that as an unmet need that resulted in disruptive behavior. And there was a promotion at that time of the child's well-being through healthy interactions versus a punitive response from our school, from our justice system. It was a behavioral health response to recognize that that child was in distress. And I have often said that when we see a child in court, and I was on the bench for 22 years, and both child welfare court and juvenile justice court and family court. And when we saw a child in court, it was often an indication that the whole family was in distress. And when we saw a family in court at the child welfare level, it was often an indication that the child was in distress. So there's really wisdom in approaching the early law violation, or even a late law violation where the youth somehow was able to manage, even with all of the trauma and all of the deficits, with that behavioral health lens. It's really incumbent upon us to do that because that's the developmentally appropriate thing to do, rather than that very harsh punitive response, even to low-level law violations. And that's why really youth courts are so important, because if we can take those low-level violations and have them diverted altogether, as long as that youth court, of course, use the trauma-informed and the culturally responsive lens that I'm talking about here today. Next. This is a slide that demonstrates the high rate of depression, adult depression with youth incarceration. It's 2.2 times more likely to have depression if you were incarcerated as a youth, as an adult. Next. And then here's a slide that talks about the best practice mandate. We are to identify policy recommendations for improved outcomes and integrated programs and services to youth. Again, this is in the law. So this is our mandate, and identify and disseminate best practices to help inform rehabilitative and restorative youth practices, including education, diversion, reentry, religious, and victim services. And again, going back to where the youth court might fit in, it's in that diversion, that restorative practice model. And we have a lot of work to do at OYCR, but our hope is to build a continuum from, I call it soup to nuts. You know, as soon as we identify a youth who may be in trouble, how are we going to get that intervention going that's trauma responsive and culturally respectful? Next. And then here's my thank you, my hope for youth courts. I took this off your website. Restorative youth practices, including education and diversion, is our mandate, and youth courts, again, are an ideal solution along the early continuum, as long as it's done appropriately, as long as kids are not stigmatized, that the youth court itself reflects the community, that the schools in communities that don't typically have youth courts are developed, schools that are maybe less resourced, and that the interventions are developmentally appropriate, always pre-law enforcement. And I think if we can make sure that there's that equitable lens, that compassion lens, then this would be a great addition to our continuum. Next. And then we have our mandate to support counties, and that's really, we're closing the state youth intervention, and we are going into the counties. And so that's what our whole office is for, is to support counties, all 58. Next. A big part of what we're doing is data, research, and reporting. We have a huge report due to the governor in 2025. We are definitely doing annual reports. We're going to be doing a summary report for the plans that were submitted in January of 2022. Those have been finalized by the end of this month. We had to make sure that each county had a plan for this rollout, and we're working closely with them. So we're starting to do the data and research, reporting and collection and analysis. Next. We also will have an ombuds office, and that ombuds office will be handling complaints from youth, families, staff, and others about any harmful conditions or practices in the new secure track facilities. And the ombudsperson will decide whether to inquire themselves or to refer the complaint to another body for investigation. So we'll have a robust way for youth to reach out and families to reach out to our office so that we can help pave the way for best outcome, best resolution for our youth in the secure track facilities. Next. The counties are eligible for what's called block grant money, juvenile justice block grant money, and that's our job is to make sure that those plans are accepted by the state and then to go ahead and release those funds. Some of the things in the plans told us about the demographics of the county, told us about their programs relating to mental health, sex offender treatment, trauma needs, family engagement, healthy adolescent development, reentry, culturally responsive programs, how they plan to keep youth in the juvenile justice arena. Teams at each county level built these plans, teams of judges, probation, prosecutors, defense counsel, behavioral health experts, all were involved in these plans. Next, please. Our job we see is threefold at the heart of it, and that's to keep youth in the juvenile justice arena, to prevent any net widening. We don't want more kids going into the secure track than used to be sent to DJJ. For example, if we know that one county usually sent 30 kids a year to the state youth facility, then if they're now sending 50 to their secure track in their backyard, then we're going to see that as net widening, and we're going to want to inquire about that. We don't want more kids in those facilities because it could be years that they're in them. And most of the counties, unfortunately, are in a position not to build a new facility, which we wouldn't want, right? We don't want more youth jails, but they're using facilities that were not necessarily designed for long-term carceral purposes for youth. So we don't want net widening. We don't want youth sent to those locations for years and years if we can prevent that. And so that's what we're also on top of. And then we also want successful reentry, and we want youth to feel empowered and welcomed back into their communities and have everything they need to be successful. Next. I'm going to just go over a couple of slides that the Burns Institute gave me around the issue of transfer hearings to the adult court. Next slide. This shows that in 2008, there was a high of about 1,200 kids sent from juvenile court to adult court. At that time, the kids would have been 14, 15, 16, 17 for prosecution. That was when there was a direct file by the DA. In 2016, late 2016, the voters passed Prop 57 and asked that only juvenile court judges send kids to the adult court. Next slide. After Prop 57 passed, we see that that year there was a significant drop, and that in 2017, 158 kids were sent to adult court. And then 2020, we have 25 sent. So we are looking to update our data, but this is what the Burns Institute gave us, telling me that there was already a huge shift in how we were intervening in the lives of youth, that even the youth that were committing the most violent crimes, keeping them in the juvenile justice arena. We want that to keep dropping. We want youth to go to the adult court only for the most serious, most egregious reasons, because we know that youth who go to the adult court actually don't fare better, that they don't get the programming they need for their adolescent development, and then they have higher recidivism. Next. We're collaborating with a lot of different people. We're collaborating with state level partners, within agency, with outside of agency. We're collaborating with local partners, with, as I had indicated, district attorneys, public defenders, looking at bringing in victim voice, advocates, Human Rights Watch, Children's Defense Fund. and that kind of thing. And so just really a lot of collaboration going on at this time. Next. I did just briefly want to talk a little bit about crossover population. I see I have questions coming in. I will answer questions when I'm told it's time to answer questions. I think I'm still okay. Is it Mary Grace that's helping me? Am I still okay on time?
You're good. You still have 25 minutes total.
Okay, great. So I did want to bring to awareness that a lot of the youth who end up in the juvenile justice system are what's called crossover youth. Crossover youth are youth who started in the foster care system or the child welfare system and end up crossing over into the juvenile justice system. And we are developing some subject matter expertise on that with the UCLA team I mentioned. We have 3 doctors. We have a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, and a social worker who have teamed up with us to help us understand the crossover population, the trauma, the different interventions that we need to have for our youth. And so we call these dually involved youth. A lot of the, we're also developing some subject matter expertise with girls and gender nonconforming youth. And we're developing expertise with our race equity work across the lifespan for children and youth in courts. We're looking at the Families First Prevention Services Act to see where we can draw those dollars and draw that teaming and the academia that's come forth around the FFPSA and the AB 2083 mandates about working with our most highly traumatized populations consistently and collaboratively through government systems. Next. With regard to the crossover youth, I pulled out this report from the Children's Data Network, and that was from 2021. That talked a little bit about some key findings from the Los Angeles dual system youth study. Next. And one of the things that it had encompassed in the report itself was a reference to a study that was done throughout the nation by OJJDP. And it talked about the number of youth that cross over. And it's really anywhere from 64% to 80%. LA County found that 80%, or maybe it was 83% of the youth had touched the child welfare system, and 80%, I believe, I think next slide, please. 80% of the Black females in LA County were identified as having dual system involvement. It specifically talked also about majority male and Hispanic. 64.1% of those in LA County had touched both systems. They defined the 4 pathways that occurs. And it also said that those with the most extensive child welfare involvement were at greatest risk for juvenile justice, detention, and subsequent recidivism. So again, I sat in both courts as a judge for years. I actually represented children in the child welfare system when I was a district attorney, and we were assigned to represent the kids in the child welfare courts. And I can tell you that it's the same families. It's the same families in both courts. It's the same families in crisis. And we really need to have a reckoning about that and make sure that we're responding in a similar way. It's really not tenable to me that on a Monday, a youth may be involved in a child welfare court proceeding, and then on a Tuesday in a juvenile justice court proceeding because they have committed a law violation. But the lens is totally different when it's the same child and it's the same family. So this crossover youth population is really important to me. And it's really important to me that we begin to have a similar approach to dealing with our justice kids as we do our child welfare kids. Next. And that report actually had a call to action. And it said that since a majority of the youth adjudicated in the justice system had prior contact with child welfare, that this was a really significant opportunity to do some upstream prevention of justice involvement. Next. And it combined, the findings themselves combined with others from this study, underscore the need to build what they're calling a delinquency prevention continuum of care that begins in the community and continues through the child welfare and justice system involvement to prevent the dual system contact. And we should be anchored in a full array of preventative services, a full array of resources and opportunities that start in the community, easy to access for families, calling that primary prevention, and services to mitigate and address risk, calling that secondary prevention, and continuing services for families and youth that are involved in justice systems and child welfare systems, calling that tertiary prevention. Next slide. One of the things I wanted to talk about today too is how we're beginning to really look at building the future for our youth who do have to be in foster care or in the juvenile justice system. And these slides are actually slides 41 through 45 are from the Youth Law Center. And over the last several years, the Youth Law Center has had an opportunity to bridge the legal, getting kids out of custody with pathways to higher education work. And they've been working on this, unifying stakeholders across California to create programs for juvenile justice youth, college programs. And there's an investment in alternative models that build a young person's future. And this is happening, and it's happening all over the state with community colleges and four-year colleges with in a variety of different ways. Next. And the opportunity of the moment is that $10 million in ongoing funding invested in the Rising Scholars Network at the California Community College Chancellor's Office movement. There's a movement to alternatives to incarceration, our 823 realignment. There's now dual enrollment legislation that passed so that kids can be dually enrolled in both high school and college when they're incarcerated. There's college access legislation under SB 716. And this is a really unique opportunity to engage our justice impacted youth for higher education. Next. And I think we need to reframe who students are that are having a juvenile justice experience as college material, as leaders on campus and in the community, and have the potential to be academically successful, curious, and insightful. And I just don't think that's the frame that we have had in the past. Even with our kids who are starting to maybe have problems early on in school, whether it's K through 12, whether it's K through 6, whether it's middle school, whether it's high school. I think we have to continue to see our kids as college material, because we know that knowledge is power, and that knowledge of our history and of our people and of ourselves is empowering, and that all minds can benefit from education. Next. So we're planting seeds, and that's building positive, next slide. Positive identity, building that positive identity for the youth during that critical time of adolescence, telling our youth who are in the justice system, just like we tell our youth at the dinner table, that they can do and be anything they want. I wonder who's telling those kids that. And if it's not us, then who's it going to be? Creating opportunities for sustainable futures in multiple career fields through degrees, certifications, helping them with university transfers, influencing future generations. I was at a panel on Monday, a convening of the Rising Scholars Program, and many of the young people who had been formerly incarcerated and who spoke told me and told us they did not know how to get on this track, that nobody in their family had. There was not an expectation that they develop their minds. In some cases, they were told over and over again that they were losers, that they would be nothing, that they could be nothing. So we can't underestimate the power of planting these seeds and being honest about it, and being not just saying it for the sake of saying it, but to really believe, to shift to a belief mindset that anything is possible for anyone, no matter what they've done, or no matter where they were born or where they come from, that anything is possible. Absolutely. Next. And here's a diagram of just this whole decarceration diagram of community college and other educational institutions that have a critical role to support community-based alternatives that are truly rehabilitative. And one of the things that I know I said on Monday was, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a step down from our secure track onto college campus, if we had a housing support of how kids could spend some time in these local secure tracks and then step down to a college campus and have a milieu that is supportive, or to a vocational training campus. But from the custody to campus is something that I want to imagine. And I think that redesigning our juvenile justice is, we need to really pull this in and pull together and use every resource available, because the number of kids that were in the DJJ facility when the closure legislation went through was about 700 to 800. I hope there's never more than 700 to 800 kids in our secure track facilities on any given day when all is said and done. But that's a population that we can wrap our heads around and our hands around and our hearts around and our resources around. So let's do that and rise to that occasion. Fostering resilience next is really important. I think that that's something that the youth courts could certainly do. The youth courts could help along the way to foster that resilience by affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every single youth, that they have helped them identify their dreams, their assets, their decisions, their pro-social decisions, be strength-based, be reliable, help to be a reliable adult in that young person's life, help them feel safe in their communities, in their schools, in their neighborhoods. Government systems can map and develop protocols to do this, to make those hot handoffs from justice systems, from school systems to community, and then nurture altruism and community connection, build that pathway, help support their own competency, and then advocate for all kinds of change in policies that honor and allow access for those who are most vulnerable. Youth courts at every high school, wouldn't that be amazing? How can we keep kids in school? I mean, kids are pushed out of school. I can tell you that the kids that I saw in court were often not in school for weeks, months, years, didn't feel welcome at school. How can youth courts create a milieu to keep kids in school, even when kids have done something wrong? And how can youth courts do that, again, with that cultural lens, with that gender affirming lens, with that lens of compassion? How can youth courts be at every high school in a way that is not harmful, but supportive? How can the kids that maybe have gotten into trouble be part of the youth court, be part of the people who help other kids? And how can they not be stigmatizing and perhaps even confidential to a certain extent, because certainly our formal courts are as well? How can we do more perhaps focus groups on each campus to see what kind of youth court would be best suited for that campus? And finally, my slide, last slide, around the fact that it's so important, next slide, it's so important to keep kids in school because education is the most powerful tool we can use to change the world. Nelson Mandela said that, and many others. But youth courts are uniquely positioned to help kids continue to feel like they belong to something. And like I said, the kids I saw in the juvenile justice arena, they had been pushed out, whether it was from a behavior that was has been documented to be overly punitive to kids of color, to kids with special ed needs, to foster kids, whether it was a family situation, a homelessness situation. How can we keep kids interested and welcome and vibrant at our schools? Lastly, is my question slide. And I think I'm just about on time, maybe even finishing up a little bit early. Who's going to help me next? Mary Grace?
Sure, we have a question that came in that asked if you could explain more about what youth courts could look like. They speak to an experience in LA County of, my experience in LA County is that they are run by judges and a DA who do not have backgrounds in child development, trauma-informed practices, or restorative practices. There are no mental health clinicians helping to design appropriate treatment plans for getting youth back on track and normal adolescent development. So can you speak to what the youth courts could look like?
I mean, I think that is I think one of the criticisms I've heard of youth courts is that they are different in every county. Certainly Judge Irvin might have more information than I do. I'm not an expert in youth courts. But one of the, as I said, one of the criticisms is that they're different in every county. I think having a judge perhaps in a youth court wasn't what youth courts were intended to be, because I know that they were trying to have youth resolve youth issues. And so I think maybe standardizing what youth courts are and having some guidelines and best practices that involve trauma-informed training. I think absolutely anybody who runs a youth court, whether it's the youth or adults should have the trauma training, should have a good understanding of adolescent development, should be anything but punitive or stigmatizing. So I think that would be a way to really boost the confidence that communities can have in how youth courts are designed.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we have another concern about violence on campus and that they don't always address the feelings of the victim. Sometimes changing schools for the victim is more traumatic for the victim.
Sure. And there are going to be some, some issues that youth courts aren't really equipped to handle. So it may not be an appropriate remedy, depending on the facts. And I agree, sometimes it's absolutely traumatizing all around for a victim to have to change schools. And often if there's restraining orders involved, really the victim is protected. So the youth would have to change schools. But if it's not to the level where that needs to happen, what the altercation, then it might be, there may be an ability to have youth courts handle it, but victim voice is important. Restorative justice includes the victim voice. There's also other ways, maybe mediation. Maybe the youth court could have a mediation component where there's a professional to handle some mediation, some healing mediation. I think that's really it, is that it has to be uniquely designed for each campus, and then it has to make sure that we address the needs of all people involved in the law violation.
Okay, and that addresses one of the questions we had. I don't know if you want to add anything of your views on a preference for non-adversarial format for youth diversion, like peer circles versus the traditional court format. I think that's what you just addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I think non-adversarial, I think even, I have a mentor named Judge Edwards, and he always said that juvenile courts were the original problem-solving courts. And problem-solving courts are non-adversarial. Once a youth has taken responsibility for their part in a law violation, then we really need to move into a non-adversarial remedy. And so looking at a whole variety of ways to do that, whether it's a therapeutic court setting, whether it's a diversion with a youth court setting, whether it's a not bringing the youth informally to any setting. Non-adversarial certainly works better for our youth and our families, and helps people get back on track sooner.
Thank you. Okay, so does California have something similar to unified family courts? They exist in Florida. The easiest description would be a one family, one judge, tying independency and family divisions. Yeah, it'd be easy for families that are have multiple cases in the same counties.
We have statutory authority for unified family courts. I know in my county, Santa Clara County, we were not able to achieve that for a sustainable period of time. We briefly did have one judge hearing cases from family court, juvenile court. But we do, what we are committed to doing is one judge, one case. So trying to make sure that the judge who hears, say, the detention hearing for either a child welfare case or a child, a detention in a juvenile justice arena, handles that matter the whole way. I know I sat on the Jules status calendar, so I was hearing cases that involved both foster youth and juvenile justice youth. So that's how we handle the crossover cases. So the short answer is yes, I believe we do have statutory authority, but in our larger counties, it's difficult to achieve.
Okay. Lot to work on, huh?
Yes.
Okay, can you speak to how state and county level collaborations take place in practice? There are many partners who share similar goals of the OYCR.
Okay, let me just, so you're asking, can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I'm gonna try to look at the chat myself too. Yeah.
If you can speak to how state and county level collaborations take place in practice. How do the state and the counties interact?
Well, so I have already indicated that we were just born, but what is envisioned and what is happening so far is that we have met with all 58 probation chiefs. I am starting to tour the facilities. I am hearing firsthand and seeing firsthand what counties need, what kind of technical assistance. We're also, we have a county liaison division. So I have a liaison from OYCR assigned to each county. We have 4 regions right now. And the 4 county liaisons, there's 2 managers over them. And so they're working as a team to reach out to counties. One of the things that we identified in their county plan that was delivered to us is where their technical assistance might be needed. So we're working directly with counties. We're identifying where they need help, whether it's data and research, whether it's culturally responsive services, whether it's keeping kids in the juvenile justice arena. And we're delivering support, and we are delivering to the extent possible resources. And we're kind of in a fact-finding stage right now, to be honest. We're also looking at other state agencies like the California Department of Education, Department of Rehabilitation, the county offices of education, and the Department of Health, the Department of Physical Health, Department of Mental Health. We are looking at how to pull our resources together to deliver them to the county so it's easy access. A lot of those resources that are already available, the counties are not aware of, or not aware of how to access them. So I know that that's kind of a high level response, but our hope is that at some point we have a catalog of resources. We know each county individually, we know what each county needs, and we're delivering that to them on the ground.
Okay.